She bought that old abandoned trailer with the last crumpled bills she had left. Thought it would just be a makeshift shelter for her 5 kids. A hiding place deep in the Appalachian woods. But when she started tearing up the rotted floor, she heard something that came from beneath the earth. A sound that would change her family's fate forever. Can you imagine losing everything, even hope itself, and having to live in a rusted piece of metal in the middle of nowhere, only to discover that right under your feet, something or someone was hidden, waiting for you? Sounds like a movie, but this really happened in the mountains of West Virginia, in 1987, and what that woman found down there wasn't just a mystery, it was a secret capable of destroying the powerful and rewriting the meaning of human courage. But let me take you back to the beginning, because what happened next was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Ruth Hawkins was 38 years old when her world shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was 1987, and the coal truck carrying the mine workers down Route 52 lost its brakes on a curve they called Devil's Bend. Her husband James never came home that night. The mining company, after months of lawyers and runaround, handed her an envelope with a check for $3,000. It was an insult. $3,000 that represented the life of a good man, a father of 5. $3,000 that fit in the pocket of her worn apron. Ruth was a widow now, with 5 mouths to feed. The oldest, Ethan, just 12, barely understanding he was now the man of the house. The twins, Lily and Rose, 8 years old. Little Noah, 5. And baby Hope, still nursing at her breast. James had been her anchor. A quiet man, with strong hands, who always came home from the mine, with a tired smile, and a piece of candy hidden for each child. She still remembered their last morning, how he'd kissed her forehead before heading out. "Take care of my babies, Ruthie," he'd said. "Promise me they'll be okay." She'd promised without knowing that promise would become a sentence of daily struggle. Moving forward was more brutal than any promise could have anticipated. Without James's paycheck, the landlord of their small rental house gave them 2 weeks to clear out. Ruth had no close family. Everyone had either died young or moved north to Ohio or Michigan looking for work. She found herself on the street, depending on the charity of the local Baptist church and what little she could earn washing other people's clothes in the creek. For 3 months they slept on the floor of the church basement, thanks to the mercy of Pastor Webb. But the pressure from the good families of the town was mounting. They didn't look kindly on a widow and her 5 kids invading God's house. Ruth knew her time there was running out. It was then, on a cold November morning, that everything changed. The church janitor, Mr. Mills, a man of few words, told her that the landlord had burned the few belongings they couldn't carry out. Ruth felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Where would she go? How would she survive? She only had $2,500 left from that compensation, hidden in a sock tied to her waist, money she'd sworn not to touch, except for a life or death emergency. This was that emergency. She walked for days with baby Hope strapped against her chest, and the other 4 clinging to her skirt, asking at every door. She was looking for work, a roof, anything. But in a small town like Harlan, a woman alone with 5 kids wasn't an opportunity. She was a problem. Doors closed with polite but firm excuses. "We already got help, ma'am. There's no room for that many people. Maybe the lumber mill needs a cook, but they don't take children." And then there were the other looks. The ones from men who saw her desperation as an invitation. The mill foreman, a fat man with a sweaty mustache, looked her up and down. "A young woman like you shouldn't struggle so much," he said, his voice insinuating. "I could offer you a nice little place, good food, in exchange for some company." Ruth felt acid rise in her throat. "I'm looking for honest work, sir," she answered, turning and walking out of there with what little dignity she had left, her children's crying following her like a shadow. For 3 nights they slept huddled under a stone bridge, covered with cardboard that Ethan had found. The mountain cold cut to the bone, and Ruth spent the nights shaking, not from cold, but from fear that her children would get sick, that rural police would take them away. The $2,500 still burned at her waist. She knew she needed to use it, not for food but for shelter, however miserable. It was on a gray afternoon, when the wind blew dust and pine needles, that Ruth walked into Joe's general store to buy a pound of cornmeal and some lard with the last loose change she had. She was dizzy from hunger but kept herself upright, refusing to appear weak. Behind the wooden counter, two men in muddy boots were drinking soda. Ruth recognized one. It was Hank, a man who did hauling in a beat-up pickup. The other was a stranger, a timber buyer. That old trailer's still sitting there rotting, Hank was saying, wiping his mouth. The owner, that crazy old hermit, died years ago, and nobody claimed it. The county wants it gone, but it's too far up the mountain, costs them more to move it. And who'd want that trash anyway, said the other. That trailer's more eaten up than Swiss cheese. They say the hermit, some guy named Howard, was into weird stuff. Disappeared just like that. Hank continued. They're asking $2,500 for just the right to occupy the land, but I bet if someone shows up with $1,500, they'd take it just to get it off their books. The place is cursed, they say. Far from everything. Only good for someone who's got nothing left to lose. Ruth felt her heart leap. A trailer for $2,500, maybe less. She had that. Could it be possible? She approached the men, her steps firm though her knees trembled. Excuse me, gentlemen. Her voice came out clearer than she expected. I'm listening about this trailer in the woods. Where exactly is it? The two men looked at her surprised. Old man Joe, the store owner, stopped weighing the cornmeal. Ma'am, Hank began with a half smile. That ain't no place for a woman, much less with young'uns. It's 3 miles off the main road, deep in the woods near Dry Creek. The trailer's sitting on cinder blocks, but the floor's rotted through. It's got no doors, the windows are busted out. And folks tell stories, the other added, lowering his voice. They say the hermit Howard didn't just die. They say he was killed over gambling debts. And at night you can hear strange sounds, like he's still there guarding his stuff. Nobody goes near after dark. Ruth swallowed hard, but showed no fear. And if someone offers $2,500, you think they'd take it? Hank let out a short laugh. Ma'am, that thing ain't worth 10, but if you got the guts to go live in that nest of critters, I'll take you myself to the county clerk. I guarantee they'll accept just to get it off their books. Let's do it then, said Ruth, untying the sock from her waist and counting the worn bills on the counter. The sound of the old paper seemed to echo in the store's silence. Here's $2,500. I want you to do me the favor of taking this offer to the clerk. Tell him it's all I have. My name is Ruth Hawkins, widow of James. You can ask Pastor Webb. The men looked at each other. Old man Joe, the shopkeeper, nodded slowly, like someone who recognizes desperation when he sees it. Hank took the bills, weighed them in his hand, and finally nodded. All right, Mrs. Ruth. I'll take your money. Come back tomorrow at noon, and I'll tell you if it went through. But I'm warning you again, that place is gonna cost you blood to make it livable. If you even can. I'm not afraid of work, Ruth answered. And there was a determination in her voice that made the men go silent. I never have been. That night, huddled with her 5 children under the bridge, for the first time in months, Ruth felt something like hope. She looked at the cold moon and whispered, James, wherever you are, help me. Give me strength to build a home for our children. The next day at noon, Hank was waiting for her at the store with a sealed paper in his hand and an expression of disbelief. Congratulations, Mrs. Ruth. Now you're the owner, legal occupant, of a 1960 aluminum trailer with 1 acre of forest land, located at Dry Creek Hollow. The clerk thought it was so funny that someone wanted to pay for that junk that he took the bills and stamped the paper without asking questions. He said, good luck getting the snakes out. Ruth took the document, a simple official paper attesting to her right. Her hands trembled as she held it. It was hers. For the first time since James died, she had something that was hers, a place in the world, a roof, even if it was full of holes. Can you take me now? She asked. Sure, load up in the truck with your young'uns. Let's go right now. The journey was torment. The 3 miles of dirt road turned into a narrow path that the truck could barely navigate. Pine branches scratched the sides of the vehicle. The farther they got from town, the thicker and quieter the forest became. The only sound was the truck crunching over dry leaves. Finally, Hank stopped the truck in a small clearing. "It's there, Mrs. Ruth." And there it was. The trailer rested crooked on cinder blocks like a beached metal animal. The aluminum, once shiny, was dull, stained with rust and moss. It was surrounded by tall weeds and pines that almost covered it. The door hung from a single hinge. The windows were empty, dark holes. Vegetation had grown everywhere, covering the turnt's steps. Ethan, the oldest, clutched his mother's hand. The twins started whimpering quietly. Hank looked at Ruth, expecting to see regret on her face. But she only took a deep breath, adjusted the baby in her arms, and walked toward the entrance. The interior was a nightmare. The smell of dampness, dead animals, and rot hit her in the face. The linoleum floor was lifted, and in several sections completely rotted, revealing the wet earth underneath. There was raccoon and rat droppings everywhere. Thick cobwebs hung from the low ceiling. In what had been the kitchen, only a rusted sink remained. At the other end, a stained and torn mattress was rotting in a corner. But Ruth saw beyond the filth. She saw 4 metal walls that, once cleaned, would protect her from the freezing mountain wind. She saw a roof that, though it leaked, was better than the open sky. She saw a floor that, though rotten, could be patched. She saw a space that was hers, that nobody could take away. "It's perfect," she said quietly, and there was no irony in her voice. Hank looked at her like she was crazy. "Perfect, ma'am." "Yes." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were full of tears. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of fierce determination. "It's ours. It's all we have. And my children and I are going to turn it into a home." Hank shook his head, still not believing it, but something in his gaze changed. "Well, you got more guts than most men I know, Mrs. Ruth. That's for sure. If you need anything from Joe's store, tell him I vouch for you. My farm's about 4 miles down the main road." "God help you." "Thank you, sir. I won't forget your kindness." When the truck disappeared, leaving behind a cloud of dust, Ruth and her 5 children stood alone facing their new property. The silence of the forest wrapped around them, thick and heavy. Ethan, at 12, clenched his fists. "We're gonna live here, Mama." The twins hid behind Ruth's skirt, and Noah started crying openly. Ruth set her jaw. "We're gonna live here," she said firmly. "It smells bad now, but it's ours. We're gonna clean it. This place will be our castle. Understand? Nobody's gonna run us off from here." And Ruth Hawkins, widow, with 5 children and a worthless trailer in the middle of nowhere, began to work. The first days were a battle against filth and abandonment. Ruth woke before dawn and worked until her muscles screamed. First, she dragged out the rotted mattress, pulling it alone into the woods, nauseous from the smell. Then, with a branch she found, she started sweeping. She swept pounds of dried droppings, rat nests, leaves, and trash that Howard the Hermit had left. Ethan helped her, his small arms struggling with the weight of the garbage. The twins, once they got over their initial fright, were sent to Dry Creek, which luckily still had a trickle of clean water about half a mile away. They went back and forth with rusty tin cans, hauling water. Ruth used that water and a piece of her own clothing to wash every inch of the interior. She scrubbed the aluminum walls, the sink, the ceiling. The smell of dampness wouldn't leave, but the smell of rot started to give way. To cover the holes in the windows, she used the same cardboard they'd used to sleep under the bridge. For the door, Ethan found some old boards in the woods, and Ruth, using rusted wire, managed to secure it in a makeshift way. It didn't close well, but at least it was a barrier against the night. For the bigger holes in the floor, she used flat stones they found at the creek, filling the gaps with mud and pine needles, creating an uneven but walkable floor. At night they all slept together in the driest corner, on a pile of dried pine needles they'd collected, covered with their only blanket. Ruth barely slept. Her body ached, listening to the sounds of the forest, the coyotes howling in the distance, the wind hitting the metal. It was a pain that kept her awake, but it was also the satisfaction of building something. It was on the morning of the 6th day that it happened. Ruth had decided they couldn't keep sleeping on pine needles in the corner. The floor in the center of the trailer was so rotten, it sank dangerously with each step. "Ethan," she told her son, "we gotta tear up this rotten wood before Noah or the girls fall through and get hurt. We'll use the dirt underneath to level it." Ethan nodded seriously. They had no tools, so on their knees, Ruth and Ethan began tearing up the pieces of linoleum and plywood with their bare hands. The wood was wet, almost dissolved, turned into a dark pulp by the moisture rising from the earth. It was disgusting work and their hands filled with splinters, but they kept going, pulling out piece after piece, throwing them outside the trailer. The hole they were opening revealed the dark earth and the metal beams of the trailer's chassis. They were working near the center, moving toward what had been the small kitchenette. It was then that Ruth's fingers hit something that wasn't soft earth or rusted metal. It was wood, solid wood. Ruth stopped. "Ethan, wait." Her heart started beating faster. For no apparent reason, she knelt down and started digging with her hands, removing the pulp of rotten wood and the damp earth that had accumulated. And there, just a few inches below the original floor level, wedged between two chassis beams, were wooden boards. They weren't part of the trailer's structure. They were thicker, put there intentionally on the earth. They were 4 wide boards of old but solid pine, each about 3 feet long, assembled perfectly, forming a square. They were covered by that layer of debris from the upper floor, as if the rotten floor had been hiding them. With her heart beating faster and faster, Ruth cleaned all the dirt around them. The boards looked old, but the wood underneath was surprisingly dry. She tried to lift one of the edges using her nails. It resisted at first, stuck by dried mud, but then it gave with a long, complaining creak. Beneath it was darkness. A void. A hole. Ruth pried with a piece of metal she'd found, and lifted the first board, then the second. And there, in the middle of the floor of her new home, was a square opening about 3 feet on each side, that descended into absolute blackness. Someone had dug this, the old hermit, Howard. But for what? To hide what? Ruth leaned over, but the smell that rose was different from dampness. It was a metallic smell, sour, a smell of confinement and sweat. She was about to call Ethan to bring the only candle they had when she heard a sound, so low she thought it was the wind, but she heard it again. It is movement, a rustling like fabric against dry earth, and then a ragged, terrified breath. Her blood froze. There was something alive down there. Ethan, pale, he grabbed his mother's arm. "What was that, Mama?" The twins, who'd been playing in a corner, went still, their big eyes fixed on the dark hole. Ruth raised a finger asking for absolute silence. The only sound was the wind, through the pine. And then, again, the breathing, a quick gasp, followed by a muffled moan. "Who's down there?" Ruth yelled, her voice shaking, grabbing the piece of metal she'd used as a lever. "Come out or I'm calling the police." The silence that followed was total, oppressive. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. Ruth leaned in a little more, her heart pounding so hard in her chest. The children had retreated against the back wall, huddled together. "Please," she tried again, her voice softer but trembling. "If there's someone there, answer. We're not gonna hurt you. We've got children." And then, like a whisper rising from the bowels of the earth, a weak, raspy voice, male and clearly terrified, answered in broken English, with a strange accent. "Help, please. Don't let them find me. Don't yell." Ruth almost dropped the metal. Her knees failed, and she had to lean on the edge of the rotten floor to keep from falling. There was a man hiding in a hole dug under her trailer. Her first thought was absolute terror. He was a criminal, a fugitive. The crazy hermit Howard, they said, was mad. Were her children in danger? She looked at Ethan, who was shaking but holding a rock in his hand, ready to defend his sisters. Ruth's fear instantly transformed into protective fury. "Come out right now. Come out with your hands where I can see them. I'm not gonna repeat it, but the only response was a dry cough and a moan of pain. I can't. I'm hurt. Please, ma'am. Water. Just water. They're looking for me. The voice was young. It didn't sound threatening, just desperate. Ruth was paralyzed, trapped between fear for her children and the plea in the voice. What should she do? Run to town? That would take hours, and she couldn't leave her children alone or drag them through the woods with a stranger hidden under her house. With her heart in her throat, Ruth made a decision. She needed to see. She needed to know what she was facing. Ethan, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Take your sisters outside. Stay by the big tree and don't move from there. Don't come in for anything until I tell you. Now, Ethan, though scared, obeyed. He grabbed the twins by the hand, picked up Noah, and guided them out of the trailer. Ruth waited until she heard their voices fade. Alone in the trailer, with the dark hole breathing at her feet, she lit the only candle they had. The flame flickered weakly. I'm gonna lower the candle, she said aloud. I'm gonna see who you are. If you try anything, I swear on my children I'll hurt you. Holding the candle in one hand and the metal tube in the other, she knelt and lowered the light into the darkness. The air rising was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else, an odor of sickness, and what the dim light revealed made her choke back a scream. It wasn't very deep. The candlelight revealed walls of compacted earth, dug by hand. It would be about 6 feet down, enough for a man to sit, but not stand. There were crude holes dug into the dirt wall, as makeshift steps. The smell of sickness and fear was stronger now. I'm coming down, Ruth said, her voice echoing in the small space. I'm not gonna hurt you. I just wanna see. She left the metal tube at the edge, within reach, but went down with just the candle. Her bare feet searched for the holes in the earth. The air below was freezing, stale. When her feet touched the bottom of packed dirt, she raised the candle, and what she saw made her blood run cold in her veins. Huddled in the farthest corner, curled up in a ball, was a boy, not a man. Barely a teenager. He couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. He was light-skinned, or at least he was under the layer of grime, mud, and dried blood. His blonde hair was matted. He wore what had once been jeans and a cotton t-shirt, now in shreds, stiff with dark blood. One of his legs was extended at an unnatural angle, swollen and purple, with 2 dirty boards tied to the sides with strips of cloth. A makeshift splint. His face was disfigured by beatings. One eye was completely closed from swelling. His lip was split, and his hands were destroyed. Broken nails, raw knuckles, as if he'd tried to dig with them. But his eye, the one visible eye, was open, wide, fixed on her with a terror so pure, so animal, that Ruth felt a stab in her stomach. Good Lord, Ruth whispered, feeling tears spring to her eyes. My God, boy, what did they do to you? The young man trembled so violently his teeth chattered. He shrank even more against the dirt wall, raising his destroyed hands as if to protect himself. No, don't turn me in, he begged, and his voice was a hoarse rasp, the English broken by an unmistakable accent. Please, ma'am, for the love of God, don't let them find me. They're gonna kill me. I swear they'll kill me. I'd rather die here. Ruth felt her heart break. He wasn't the hermit Howard. He wasn't a killer. He was a kid. A lost and terrified kid, hiding under the earth like a wounded animal. The fear she felt for her children was still there, but now it was mixed with overwhelming compassion. Calm down, she said gently, lowering herself slowly into a squat so as not to scare him more. I'm not gonna turn you in to anyone. I'm not gonna hurt you. I swear on the lives of my 5 children. I swear. The boy looked at her, the terror in his good eye fighting against a glimmer of hope. Who are you? My name's Ruth. Ruth Hawkins. I just moved into this trailer today, a few hours ago. She showed him her hands dirty with mud and rotten wood. I didn't know there was anyone here. Nobody told me anything. You moved in? The boy blinked, confused. This place was abandoned. I've been here for a long time. Well, it's not abandoned anymore, Ruth said firmly. Now it's mine. It's my home. And what's your name? The boy hesitated, his eyes going from Ruth's face to the dark opening above, as if calculating whether he could trust her. Finally, in a voice almost inaudible, he answered, Tyler. My name's Tyler. Tyler Bennett. Tyler, Ruth repeated softly. The name sounded strange in the dampness of that hole. How long have you been down here, Tyler? The boy looked into the darkness as if trying to count the days on the dirt walls. I don't know. A long time. The leg. I think it was 2 weeks ago. Maybe more. I lost count of the suns. Ruth felt a knot in her throat. 2 weeks or more. This boy had been surviving in a hole under the earth. Wounded. Alone. While she was fighting for a roof in town. And what did you eat? How did you survive? Tyler looked down, ashamed. I had a backpack with some granola bars. They ran out maybe 5-6 days ago. Water. There was a bottle but it ran out. I was licking moisture off the dirt. Ruth's stomach contracted. In your leg? What happened? Those bruises? Tyler closed his good eye, as if reliving the moment. They threw me out of the truck. I tried to run, but they caught me. They beat me with the rifle butts. I thought they were gonna kill me right there in the woods. They broke my leg with their boots. Then they laughed and left. They left me there for the coyotes to eat. Who? Ruth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who did this to you? Terror returned to Tyler's face, so intense that Ruth took a step back. Them. Mr. Garrett's men. The guards from the lumber mill. The lumber mill, the same place where the foreman had made her that indecent proposition. Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of the hole. Mr. Garrett was the owner of half the county, a powerful and feared man who they said controlled everything, from the timber to the county sheriff. They're looking for me, Tyler whispered, tears finally breaking through the grime on his face. They're offering money for me. I heard it in town before they found me. $10,000. $10,000 for finding the spy college boy. $10,000. It was an unimaginable fortune. Ruth could feel the weight of that figure. With that money she could buy a real house in Charleston, send her kids to school, live without fear, without hunger. All she had to do was climb out of that hole, walk to town, find Mr. Garrett, and tell him where the boy was. It would guarantee her 5 children's future. But then she looked at those terrified eyes, that broken body, that kid, because that's what he was, a foreign and destroyed kid. She looked at her own hands, calloused from washing other people's clothes, from tearing up rotten wood, to give her children a roof. And Ruth knew there was no choice. I'm gonna get food, she said finally. And water. You need to eat. And something for that leg. It's bad. Real bad. After that we'll figure out what to do. Are you gonna turn me in? Tyler asked, trembling. Ruth looked him straight in the eyes, and told him the truth. She felt in her gut. No, I won't. But you need to tell me your story. You need to tell me how you got here, why they call you a spy, why they're looking for you. I need to know what I'm getting my children into. Tyler nodded slowly, relief flooding his face, though terror still clung to him. Ruth climbed the dirt steps, her body heavy, not just from the effort, but from the weight of the decision she'd just made. A decision that put her 5 children in the same crosshairs as that boy. Once up top, she called Ethan. Come quick but quiet. The kids ran in, their little faces pale with fear. What was it, Mama? A ghost? Ruth hugged them all tight, her heart pounding against her ribs. Listen to me good, she said, her voice low and urgent, kneeling to look them in the eyes. It's not a ghost. It's a person. A boy. He's badly hurt, and very scared. He's hiding. Ethan's eyes widened. Hiding from who? Is he a thief? No, Ruth said firmly. Bad people hurt him. Powerful people from town. Now listen, this is the most important thing I've ever asked you in my life. Nobody, absolutely nobody can know he's here. Understand? Not your friends from town. Not Old Man Joe. Not Pastor Webb. Nobody. If you talk, those bad people will come. And they won't just take him. They'll hurt us. You understand the danger? The children nodded, their faces solemn with the weight of a secret they barely understood. Promise it on your daddy, Ruth whispered. We promise, Mama. Ethan said, his child's voice trying to sound like a man's. Ruth covered the opening again with the boards, disguising them as best she could with the pieces of rotten wood and dirt. Stay here. Play quietly. She ran to where they had their meager supply. They had a little cornmeal, lard, and a paper bag of pinole that Old Man Joe had given them as a gift. They had no bread, no medicine. She took a tin jar, filled it with water from the creek that the girls had hauled, and mixed a little pinole with cold water in a dirty plastic cup. It was a miserable meal, but it was all she had. She returned to the hole, removed the boards, and went down carefully. She found Tyler where she'd left him, shaking in the corner. Here, she said, holding out the jar of water. Drink slowly. Your stomach's not used to it. Tyler grabbed the jar with his destroyed hands, and drank. Water running down his dirty chin. Tears of relief and pain mixing with the liquid. It was like watching a dead man come back to life. He drank almost half before Ruth gently took it away. Slow. Now eat this. She gave him the cup of pinole. Tyler devoured it, using his wounded fingers to scrape the sides, not caring about the dirt. Each swallow was a painful effort. When he finished, he leaned back against the dirt wall, closing his good eye for a moment. The immediate relief of food and water seemed to give him a bit of clarity. He opened it and looked at Ruth with a look of gratitude so deep it hurt her. Thank you, he whispered. God. Thank you. Ruth sat on the cold floor across from him. Now talk, Tyler. Why do they call you a spy? What did you see? Tyler took a deep breath, air whistling in his chest. I'm a student at West Virginia University. I study forestry conservation. I came here as a volunteer for a project about illegal logging in the Appalachians. Ruth nodded, understanding. The timber. Mr. Garrett's lumber mill. I had a camera, Tyler continued, his voice low. I was documenting the trucks leaving at night, loaded with huge logs, old growth trees. They were using routes that weren't on any maps. But it wasn't just timber, Ruth, Tyler said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Even though it was just the two of them in the hole, it was something else. One night I followed the trucks. They went off the timber route and went into a hollow that's not on any map. I drove my Jeep as far as I could, and then walked. There was a clandestine airstrip, small, just dirt, but lit up with generators. He stopped, swallowing hard, the memory vivid in his good eye. I saw them unload the logs, but some were hollow. They were pulling out packages, wrapped in brown tape, and loading new rifles into the same hollow logs. It was an exchange. I saw Mr. Garrett himself there talking to men who weren't from here. They spoke English like me, but they were different, with expensive clothes, and I saw the county sheriff, Sheriff Colt, receiving a briefcase. I was hidden in the rocks, Tyler continued, his body shaking from the memory. I was taking pictures with a long lens. I had to. I had proof. But I stepped on a branch. A small sound. But one of the guards heard me. He yelled. They started shooting. I ran. I ran like never before in my life, back to my Jeep. But they were faster. They knew the terrain. They surrounded me. I had nothing. Just my camera. Tears ran down his dirty face. They grabbed me, dragged me back to the clearing in front of Mr. Garrett. He didn't even look at me. He just said, "Take the camera and burn it. And him, make sure the coyotes eat well tonight. Make it look like an accident." The college boy got lost and fell down a ravine. Ruth closed her eyes, imagining the terror. They beat me. All of them. With their boots, with the butts. They asked me who I worked for. DEA? The government? I screamed at them I was a student. I only cared about the trees, but they didn't believe me. Or they didn't care. Sheriff Colt. He was the one who broke my leg. He jumped on it. I heard the crack, and then they just laughed and left. They left me lying in the woods miles from here with my broken leg, bleeding. But how did you get here? Ruth asked, confusion mixed with horror. If they left you so far away. I don't know, Tyler whispered. I crawled. I don't know for how long, days maybe. Or one long night. I'd pass out. I'd wake up. It was raining. I was so thirsty. I just knew I had to move, get away from that place. My hands. I dragged myself with my hands. He raised his destroyed hands covered with scabs and dirt. As proof, I saw this trailer. It looked abandoned. A shelter. I dragged myself through the door that was hanging off. I thought I could just die here, but under a roof, I was lying on the floor, right here, shaking from cold, and I felt the boards were loose. I don't know why. Instinct. I pushed. I found the hole. This hole. I thought, down here they won't find me. Down here it's dark. I slid inside. It was agony with my leg. And I managed to pull the boards back over, and I stayed here, listening, waiting for them to come back, waiting to die. And then I heard you. Your children. I thought they'd come back to finish the job. The silence that followed was thick, loaded with the truth of what he'd just confessed. Ruth understood. This boy hadn't just seen a crime. He'd seen the heart of Mr. Garrett's empire. And $10,000 wasn't a reward. It was the price to silence him forever. But something was gnawing at Ruth's mind. A question she had to ask, even though she was terrified of the answer. She looked at Tyler's broken body, his destroyed hands, his shattered leg, and she thought about her own 5 children sleeping upstairs on pine needles, hungry and scared. She thought about that $10,000. Enough to change everything. Enough to give her babies a real life. The temptation was a living thing, crawling up her spine like a snake. All she had to do was walk to town. Just walk. Find Sheriff Colt. Collect the money. Her children would eat. They'd have warm clothes. A real house. Medicine when they got sick. School. A future. It would be so easy. Tyler would never know. He was half dead already. Maybe it would even be a mercy. Better than rotting in this hole. The thoughts came fast. Seductive. Wrapped in the faces of her hungry children. Lily's hollow cheeks. Rose's thin arms. Noah's constant crying. Baby Hope's weak suckling. Wasn't a mother supposed to do anything for her children? Anything. But then she heard James's voice. As clear as if he were wending beside her in that damp hole. Cuida a mismo muchachos. Ruthie. Promise me they'll be okay. And she realized something that hit her like a fist to the chest. Taking care of her children didn't just mean feeding them. It meant teaching them what kind of people to be, what kind of world to build. If she sold this boy's life for money, what would she be teaching Ethan? That money was worth more than a human soul. That you could look the other way when someone was suffering if the price was right. That survival meant abandoning your humanity. No, she couldn't, because then her children might survive. But they wouldn't be her children anymore. They'd be something else. Something broken. And James would never forgive her. She would never forgive herself. Ruth stood up in that hole, her decision made, and it settled over her like armor. Heavy. Unbreakable. You're not gonna die here, she said. And her voice was steel. And they're not gonna find you. We're gonna figure this out. Together. Tyler looked at her, with his one good eye. And for the first time since she'd found him, she saw something other than terror. She saw hope. Fragile. Flickering like a candle in the wind. But hope nonetheless. Ruth climbed out of the hole, and immediately set to work. She couldn't keep Tyler down there. The smell alone would kill him, and his leg was getting worse by the hour. She needed to bring him up, clean that wound properly, and figure out their next move. With Ethan's help, they managed to haul Tyler up through the opening. The boy screamed, a sound so raw and broken that Ruth had to cover his mouth with her hand. They dragged him to the corner with the pine needles and laid him down. The twins stared with wide eyes. Noah hid behind his mother's skirt. Baby Hope slept on, oblivious. Ruth sent Ethan and Lily back to the creek for more water. If you hear a car, a horse, anything, you scream like you saw a rattlesnake, and you run. You hear me? They nodded and took off. Ruth turned her attention to Tyler's leg. She'd seen bad wounds before. James had come home from the mine with crushed fingers, broken ribs, burns from the equipment. But this was different. This was rot. She could smell it. The infection had set in deep. She cut away what was left of Tyler's jeans with her only knife. the small one she used for cutting cornmeal. What she saw made her want to vomit. The bone was sticking out through the skin, the flesh around it was green and black. The makeshift splint was crawling with maggot. Tyler screamed as she cleaned it. A low, guttural sound that made the children whimper in the corner. He was burning with fever. She had no alcohol, no medicine, nothing. And then she remembered what her grandmother used to do back in the hollers for infections. "Ethan," she called out the window, "go to the pines. Bring me sap, the stickiest you can find, now." When the boy came back with his hands full of golden, sticky pine resin, Ruth applied it directly to the open wound. Tyler howled and passed out. Ruth knew it would either kill the infection or kill him. It was their only chance. The days that followed turned into a routine of unbearable tension. The 5 children became silent sentinels. Their game was now called the watch. They spread out in the woods around the trailer, with clear instructions. If they saw any strangers, Noah was to cry. The twins were to run screaming. And Ethan was to whistle like a whip-poor-will, the maximum alert signal. Inside the trailer, Tyler floated between consciousness and delirium. The fever consumed him. Ruth kept him hydrated with creek water and fed him the little cornmeal they had. Now divided between 7, hunger was a constant pain in everyone's stomach. Ruth barely slept, sitting beside the boy, changing the wet rags on his forehead, listening. In the darkness of the trailer, with the children sleeping piled in the other corner, Tyler talked in his delirium. He talked about snow, about mountains in Colorado, about a mother who made apple pie, about a dog named Buddy. He rambled in feverish fragments about the beauty of the trees he'd come to save, about how he couldn't understand why men killed for money, for powder. Ruth listened. In those fevered murmurs she didn't see a college spy, she saw a son, she saw the innocence she was fighting to protect in Ethan. Sitting in the darkness, she whispered back to him. She told him about James, about how he laughed, about how his hands were strong. She talked about the eviction, the humiliation, the fear she felt every night that she couldn't protect her children. An unlikely alliance formed in that piece of rusted metal. A bond, forged in shared fear and human decency. He was her secret, her burden, but also, strangely, her connection to a world of ideals she thought no longer existed. She was protecting not just a boy but proof that her husband James hadn't died in vain, that goodness still mattered. But reality came knocking faster than she expected. The cornmeal was running out. Tyler's wound, while not worse, wasn't improving. He needed real food. She'd have to go to town. She'd have to risk it. On the morning of the 8th day, the situation was unsustainable. The last handful of cornmeal had gone into yesterday's watery gruel. Baby Hope cried weakly against Ruth's dry chest. Her own hunger was drying up her milk. The hunger of her other 4 children was a sharp pain. A heavy silence in the trailer that was worse than any crying. Ethan, pale with deep circles under his eyes, looked at her with adult eyes. "Mama, Noah's real hungry. We got nothing left." Ruth knew she couldn't wait anymore. Tyler needed real food to fight the fever devouring him. And her own children were becoming malnourished. She had to go to town. The thought filled her with icy dread. Leaving Tyler, who was delirious about snow and dogs named Buddy, with Ethan as the only protector, was a terrifying risk. But walking the 3 miles of woods and dirt road to Harlan, where Mr. Garrett's men surely watched, was worse. And if they saw her, if they asked why she was buying food for 7 instead of 6, if they noticed the tension in her eyes. But there was no choice. It was go or watch her family and the boy she'd sworn to protect slowly die in that trailer. But who could she turn to? Pastor Webb at the church had already proven weak, giving in to pressure from the good families to kick her out of the basement. She couldn't trust a man who feared gossip more than God. Hank was a possibility. He'd offered her credit and respect, but his farm was far in the opposite direction, and he was a rough, unpredictable man. How would he react to such a deadly secret? Only one name remained: Old Man Joe, the elderly owner of Joe's General Store. Ruth remembered the way he'd looked at her when she bought the trailer, Not with pity but with recognition, like someone who'd seen the bottom of desperation and respected it. He'd given her the pinole without her asking. He was an old man, a pillar of the town who must know Mr. Garrett's crimes better than anyone. Maybe, just maybe, his silence and apparent neutrality hid a deep hatred for the man who was rotting the mountains. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had. She needed food, and more importantly, she needed alcohol, bandages, and something for the infection. She left Ethan in charge, giving him the rusted machete they'd found. "Ethan," she said, her voice low and fierce, "you're not playing watch. This is real. If anyone comes near, if you hear a truck, any truck, don't open up. Scream. Scream like you're dying and protect your sisters. You understand? Protect this trailer no matter what." The 12-year-old boy nodded, his knuckles white, gripping the machete handle. Ruth walked out of the trailer feeling naked, every inch of her skin alert. The hour-and-a-half walk to Harlan was torture. Every branch that snapped sounded like a rifle being cocked. When she reached town, the dusty streets seemed like a battlefield to her. She forced herself to walk slowly, not to seem scared, to nod hello to the few people she saw. She entered Joe's general store. The bell over the door rang, a sharp sound that seemed like a fire alarm to her. Thank God the store was empty, except for Old Man Joe, who was stacking cans of chilies on a shelf. "Morning, Joe," Ruth said, surprised at the calm in her voice. The old man turned. His small, sharp eyes studied her over his glasses. "Mrs. Ruth thought the cold would have run you off that trailer by now." "We're holding on," she said. "I need you to give me credit." "What?" Hank said. "I'm getting paid for washing clothes next week, and I'll pay you back." Old Man Joe shrugged. "Hank's a man of his word." "What you need?" 5 pounds of cornmeal, 2 of beans, lard, salt." She paused, her heart rising to her throat. "And do you have rubbing alcohol? Hydrogen peroxide?" "One of my boys, Noah, he fell in the creek, cut his knee on a rock real bad. It looks awful. It's swollen and hot." There was a long silence. Old Man Joe put down the can of chilies he was holding on the counter very slowly. His sharp eyes, which seemed to see beyond skin, locked onto Ruth. He didn't look at her face, but at her hands. Calloused hands, yes, but also trembling, knuckles white with tension. Then his gaze slowly rose to her eyes, and Ruth felt that old man could see every lie, every fear, every hidden truth she carried. The shopkeeper said nothing for a moment. A silence so long that Ruth began to fear she'd made a fatal mistake. The air in the store felt thick, loaded with smells of dried spices, soap, and something else. Danger. Finally, Old Man Joe sighed. A long, tired sound that seemed to come from the bottom of his 80 years of life. "Noah," he said quietly, almost a murmur. "The 5-year-old, right? He's a strong boy. But it's not for him you're buying this, is it, Mrs. Ruth?" Ruth's heart stopped. Panic flooded her, cold and paralyzing. She wanted to run, deny, grab her things and flee, but her feet were glued to the floor. Old Man Joe looked at her, and there was no accusation in his eyes, just deep sadness. Slowly he walked to the front door, raised his hand, and turned the open sign so it said closed. The click of the lock turning echoed in the silence like a gunshot. Ruth felt the world shrink to that small store. She was trapped. "Look, ma'am," the old man continued, his voice still low, coming back behind the counter. "I've been at this counter for 40 years. I've seen this town go from a little mining community to Mr. Garrett's personal hell. I know every person who comes through that door. I know who buys on credit because they don't have money, and who steals because they're bad. And I've seen you. I saw you when you were sleeping under the bridge. I saw you go to that trailer with your 5 kids. That's called desperation, but what I see in your eyes now, that's not desperation. That's terror. It's the terror of someone hiding something that could get them killed." He leaned in a little toward her, his voice barely a whisper. 6 days without coming here and now you're buying food for an army, and alcohol for a bullet wound. It's not Noah, ma'am. It's the boy, the college kid they're looking for. Ruth crumbled. It was as if her legs, her spine, her will dissolved. She grabbed the counter to keep from falling, and the tears she'd held back for 8 days burst out. Hot tears of hunger, of fear, of unbearable terror. My children, she couldn't form words. They're starving. He has his leg. God, it smells like death. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I found him there. Old Man Joe didn't interrupt her. He let her cry, his face impassive but his eyes full of somber compassion. What you're doing, daughter, he said finally, using a word that completely disarmed her. It's suicidal madness. You know what they'll do to you if they find you. You know what they'll do to your children. Mr. Garrett doesn't play around. That boy saw what he shouldn't have. He saw the airstrip. Ruth's head snapped up, her teary eyes full of surprise. You knew? We all know, Joe said bitterly. Everyone who's been here more than 2 days knows what goes on in these mountains. We know about the hollow timber, the packages, the guns, and we know to keep quiet, because whoever talks, or whoever helps someone who talks, ends up floating in the river or doesn't wake up at all. What you did by pulling that boy out of that hole was signing your death warrant and your children's. I couldn't let him die, Ruth whispered, wiping away tears with anger. My children were hungry, but I couldn't let a human being rot under my floor. What kind of mother would I be if I taught them that? What kind of world are we leaving if we all keep quiet? Old Man Joe looked at her for a long, long moment. A strange light flickered in his old eyes. Something Ruth couldn't decipher. Admiration? Pity? Finally he nodded as if he'd made a decision. You've got more guts than most men I know, Mrs. Ruth. That, or you're plumb crazy, maybe they're the same thing. He moved through the store with surprising agility for his age. He threw the 5 pounds of cornmeal in a sack, the beans, the lard, but then he added a package of beef jerky, a wheel of farm cheese, and a big bag of animal crackers for the kids. Here, he said, pushing it all toward her. Then he went to the back room. Ruth heard the sound of bottles. He came back with a cardboard box. There's no rubbing alcohol or hydrogen peroxide here, he said quietly. That draws too much attention. This is better. He opened the box. It was full of small bottles of cheap moonshine. The kind that burns. This'll kill the infection better than alcohol. Clean the wound with this, and this. He pulled out a dark glass jar with no label, full of yellow powder. Penicillin for livestock. But it works the same in men. Mix a little with boiled water and have him drink it 3 times a day. If he survives the fever, this'll save him from the gangrene. Ruth stared at him, unable to believe it. Old Man Joe, why? Because I'm tired, the old man said, and his voice was suddenly full of cold venom. I'm tired of watching that man steal these mountains, poison our young people and kill whoever opposes him. You know, I had a grandson. He was about your college boy's age, smart, wanted to be a forest engineer. He started asking questions just like your boy did, questions about the logging, about the permits. 2 years ago he fell off a cliff while measuring trees. Mr. Garrett even came to my store to give me his condolences. The pain in the old man's voice was so palpable that Ruth felt a chill. Helping you won't bring back my grandson. But if that boy lives, if he manages to get out of here and tell what he saw, it's a small pebble in that monster's shoe. And for that it's worth the risk. The old man looked out the window, checking the street. But you can't stay in that trailer. It's the first place they'll look if someone saw you. We don't have anywhere to go, Ruth said, desperation returning. There's a place, Old Man Joe said, again in a whisper. A refuge 3 days' journey crossing the hollow toward the ridge. It's an old abandoned mining camp. The hideaway. It's hard to get to. The path is dangerous. But if you can make it across, you'll be safe. People live there. People who are also hiding from Garrett. People who lost everything like you and me. But you need papers. The college boy can't travel like that. And neither can you. Not with 5 kids and a wounded boy. You're gonna have to cross through roads where the sheriff's department patrols, and they've got the boy's picture. Ruth felt hope ignite. Papers. A birth certificate. An ID. Something better, the old man said. I can get you papers. a fake federal transit permit, saying you're a health worker, and he's an assistant who had an accident, and birth certificates for your kids. But it's not perfect. A trained eye will know it's fake. But if they don't look close, it'll work. It'll give you enough time to get to the hollow road. You can do that, Ruth whispered. I can, but it takes time. I need to get the right stamps. The paper. It's dangerous. Give me 2 weeks. Not a day less. Come back in exactly 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Ruth repeated. We'll survive. And the road, I can't draw you a map. It's too risky. When you come back for the papers, I'll tell you from memory. Ruth walked out of Old Man Joe's store with the heavy sack on her back and the cardboard box in her arms. The moonshine and the jar of penicillin were hidden under the beef jerky and cornmeal. Each step back to the trailer was an agony of paranoia. Every farmer who waved from a distance seemed like one of Mr. Garrett's spies. The afternoon sun numbed the back of her neck, and the weight of the food was nothing compared to the weight of the secret she now shared with the old shopkeeper. 2 weeks? They had to survive 2 more weeks, hidden in plain sight in a metal trailer in the middle of enemy territory. When she finally reached the clearing, she saw Ethan's pale little face peeking out from one of the broken windows. Seeing her, the boy disappeared, and a second later, the makeshift door opened. Her 4 children surrounded her in silence, their eyes fixed on the sack. Ethan just said, "Mama," with relief so deep it almost made her cry. But there was no time for relief. "Ethan, keep watch. Lily, Rose, take care of Noah and Hope. Quiet. Nobody goes out." She went in and went straight to Tyler. The boy was worse than when she'd left. His breathing was a rattle, and the smell of his leg filled the small space. "Tyler, listen to me," she said firmly, shaking him. "I brought medicine. It's gonna hurt worse than hell, but it's this or death. Bite down on this." She put a dirty stick between his teeth. Without hesitating, she opened a bottle of moonshine, and asking God's forgiveness silently, poured half of it over the open, festering wound. Tyler's scream was muffled by the stick, a guttural, animal sound that made the twins sob in the corner. His body arched from the pain, convulsing on the pine needles. Ruth, with tears running down her own face but with steady hands, used her last clean rags to scrub the wound, cleaning out the rot, the pus, the remains of the resin. Then she opened the jar of penicillin and sprinkled the yellow powder generously directly onto the raw flesh and exposed bone. "It's done, boy. It's done," she whispered as he trembled, passed out from the pain. That night, for the first time in days, her children ate. Ruth made thick cornmeal tortillas with lard and salt, and gave them little pieces of beef jerky. The animal crackers were distributed like treasure, one by one. Seeing her children chew, seeing baby Hope nurse at her breast that finally had a little milk again, gave Ruth the strength to endure. The most tense routine of their lives began. 2 weeks felt like 2 centuries. During the day, Tyler burned with fever. Ruth gave him the dissolved penicillin powder in boiled water 3 times a day, and cleaned the wound with moonshine twice. The smell of alcohol and sickness stuck to the trailer's walls. Miraculously, on the 5th day, the blackness in the legs stopped advancing. On the 7th, the fever began to subside. Not completely, but Tyler stopped delirious rambling about Colorado. On the 9th, he opened his good eye and looked at her. Really looked at her. "Ruth," he whispered, and she knew he was going to live. But fate wasn't going to give them the 2 weeks. It was on the afternoon of the 10th day, a gray, silent day. Ruth was outside washing the rags in a bucket when she heard it. Not a horse. The unmistakable sound of an engine, a truck coming up the forest path. Before she could react, she heard the sharp, piercing whistle. Ethan's whip-poor-will whistle, the maximum alert signal. Ethan's whistle was a knife of ice in Ruth's heart. The sound of the engine got louder. It was a big truck forcing its way down the narrow path. Her blood froze. "Ethan," she screamed, running toward the trailer. "Get them in the corner, under the blanket. Now." Her children, trained by fear, scurried to the darkest corner where Ruth had piled more pine needles and their only blanket. "And him, Mama," Ethan whispered, his eyes fixed on Tyler, who was pale, conscious, but too weak to move. There was no time to get him to the hole. It was covered by the rotten mattress and the boards. Moving it would take precious minutes. There was nowhere to hide. The trailer was one room. "Help me," Ruth hissed. They grabbed Tyler by the shoulders and dragged him with a muffled moan of pain from him toward the other end where the rusted sink was. There was a small gap underneath, barely a cabinet with no doors. "Get in," she ordered. "Curl up." Tyler, understanding the panic, used his last strength to fold his body, tucking his wounded leg first. It was an unnatural, painful position. "The blanket, the rags," Ruth yelled. Ethan handed her the pile of rags they used for cleaning, dirty with mud and food. Ruth threw them over Tyler, covering him, putting the dirty tin pots on top. It looked like a pile of garbage. She'd barely finished when the truck braked hard in front of the trailer, its tires screeching on stone. It was 2 trucks. 4 men. Ruth felt the world stop. She recognized the man who got out of the first truck. It was the mill foreman, the one who'd made her that indecent proposition. And the one coming beside him, wearing a county sheriff's uniform with a belly hanging over his belt, was Sheriff Colt. The same man who, according to Tyler, had broken his leg. Ruth walked out of the trailer, drying her wet hands on her skirt, forcing her legs not to shake. She put her body blocking the makeshift entrance. "Morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Can I help you? We're far off the road." Sheriff Colt laughed, a laugh without joy. "Morning, ma'am. Hell of a nest you found yourself." His small, cruel eyes ran over her from top to bottom, stopping at her bare feet. "I'm Sheriff Colt. We're looking for someone, a college kid, tall, blonde. He went missing a few weeks back. Mr. Garrett's real worried about him, offering $10,000. A lot of money." The foreman spit tobacco near her feet. "They told us a widow moved into this dump. Funny timing, ain't it? Right when the college boy disappears around here." Ruth forced a tired smile. "A college kid? Sir, I barely know what's happening in town. It's just me and my 5 children here. We haven't seen anybody. Just coyotes and snakes." Sheriff Colt stepped closer, narrowing his eyes, sniffing the air. "What's that smell?" "Smells like a bar and medicine." Ruth's heart skipped. "The moonshine. The penicillin." "It's my son Noah," she said quickly, the lie she'd prepared for Old Man Joe coming out. "He fell in the creek. Cut his knee. It got infected bad. Old Man Joe gave me credit for a little moonshine and some powder to clean it. He's got a fever." Colt studied her, his gaze calculating. "And you live here alone? 5 kids? That's brave." "It's not bravery, sir. It's necessity," Ruth answered. "You don't mind if we take a look around, do you?" Colt said, his hand resting on his pistol holster. "Just to make sure you haven't seen anything." Ruth felt her knees fail, but she stayed upright. "Go ahead, Sheriff. I got nothing to hide. Just please don't scare my children. They're in the corner sleeping." It was the worst moment of Ruth's life. Sheriff Colt and the foreman entered the trailer, having to duck their heads. The space was ridiculously small for 2 such large men, plus Ruth and her 5 children. The smell of dampness, cheap moonshine, and the faint sweet stench of infection was suffocating. A punch to the face. "Let's see," Colt said, his voice booming in the metal box. "Where's this sick boy you're talking about?" Ruth clenched her hands so hard her nails dug into her palms. "There. In the corner. They're sleeping. They got scared with the trucks." Colt walked down the narrow aisle, his heavy boots hitting the floor patched with mud. He passed less than 2 feet from the sink cabinet where Tyler was curled up. Ruth felt the air leave her lungs. The foreman, meanwhile, stayed near the entrance, looking with obvious disgust at the rusted sink in the mess. Colt reached the corner, where the 5 children were huddled under the one threadbare blanket. With a rough, dismissive movement, he pulled the blanket off. Ethan looked at him with silent hatred, protecting the twins with his body. Noah trembled, his eyes like saucers, but his knee, though dirty, was visibly healthy. You said he was hurt, Colt growled, his hand instinctively going to his pistol. I cleaned it with the moonshine, Ruth stammered. That's why it smells like that. He's scared. Please don't touch them. Colt looked at her. His suspicion was palpable poison. Ruth knew Noah didn't look like a boy with an infected wound. He looked pale from hunger, not fever. The sheriff bent down as if to grab Noah. But at that precise instant, the foreman, bored, moved toward the sink. And what the hell is this? He said, more to himself. He raised his heavy boot and kicked hard at the pile of dirty rags and tin pots covering Tyler. Ruth felt the world stop. The metallic bang of the boot against the pots was deafening in the small space. The foreman had kicked directly at the hiding place. Under those rags, the toe of his boot must have hit Tyler's body. Maybe his wounded leg. Ruth closed her eyes, expecting the scream, the gunshot, the end of everything. She saw Colt's face turn sharply toward the noise, but there was no sound. Only the trembling of the pots as they settled. Just trash and stinking rags. The foreman spat, wiping his boot on the floor. Ruth's heart wasn't beating. Time had stopped. Tyler hadn't moved. He hadn't made a sound. Colt watched the pile of garbage under the sink for a second. Then he looked at the terrified children and the absolute misery of the place. The smell was unbearable. He sighed, a mixture of frustration and disgust. Let's get out of here, Chi. This place stinks of misery and sour milk. Not college boy. If he was here, he'd be dead from the smell alone. He turned with difficulty and walked out into the fresh air. The foreman gave Ruth one last look of contempt and followed him. Sorry for the trouble, ma'am, Colt yelled from outside, his voice loaded with sarcasm that froze her bones. If you see a blonde college kid, don't bother telling us. I doubt he's worth coming up to this shithole for. Ruth didn't move. She heard the truck doors slam, the engines roar hard, and the sound of tires crushing the undergrowth as they turned around. She didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't cry. Not until the sound of the engine completely disappeared, absorbed by the dense silence of the forest. Ruth stood by the door like a pillar of salt for a full minute after the last echo of the engine faded. Her children stayed huddled in the corner, Ethan with his arms out, protecting them, not moving. Nobody breathed. Finally, with a tremor that shook her whole body, Ruth moved. She didn't go to her children. She lunged toward the sink, tearing off the pots and dirty rags with frantic hands. Tyler, for God's sake, answer me. At first there was no response. Ruth's heart stopped. He's dead. The kick killed him. Or he suffocated trying not to scream. Tyler, she ripped off the last rag. The boy was there, his eyes closed, deathly pale, curled in an impossible fetal position. But he was breathing. Faintly. They're gone, he whispered. And Ruth saw that his mouth was full of blood. When the foreman kicked him, he'd bitten through his lower lip almost completely to keep from screaming. The pain of the kick to his broken leg must have been agony. Ruth couldn't even imagine. They're gone, she whispered, helping him out desperately, dragging him back to the pine needle. They're gone. You're safe. When Tyler came out into the light and Ethan and the girls finally dared to move, they all froze. We're not safe, Ruth said, her voice suddenly empty of all fear, replaced by cold, terrifying certainty. We can't wait anymore. She looked at Ethan. It's not 2 weeks. It's now. Ethan's eyes widened. But the papers, Mama. Old Man Joe said. There's no time for papers, Ruth said, her mind working at feverish speed. That man, Colt, he didn't believe it. He saw Noah's knee. He smelled the moonshine. He'll be back. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But he'll be back, and he won't be nice. The relief of surviving the encounter evaporated instantly, replaced by deeper, smarter panic. Colt wasn't stupid. He'd given them a sarcastic warning, but his eyes said something else. He'd come back, maybe at night, maybe tomorrow to check again, and he wouldn't be as kind. We're leaving, Ruth said, and her voice allowed no argument. Where, Mama? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Away, to a place called the Hideaway, a place Old Man Joe told me about. But the papers? Tyler whispered, spitting blood. No time for papers. We leave tonight. Soon as it's dark. The rest of the afternoon was a silent, desperate frenzy. There was no time to think, only to act. Ruth explained to Ethan the route Old Man Joe had mentioned in passing, crossing the hollow toward the ridge. It was terribly vague information, but it was all they had. Ethan, you'll carry Noah. Lily, you hold Rose's hand and don't let go for anything. I'll carry Hope and help Tyler. The problem was Tyler. He couldn't walk. His leg was destroyed, and the foreman's kick had swollen it to twice its size. I can't, Tyler said, tears of frustration and pain running down his face. I'm gonna slow you down. They're gonna catch me. You go, please. Save your children. Shut up, Ruth snapped, her voice like a whip. I didn't save you from gangrene to leave you here, and I didn't save you from Colt so you could give up. You're gonna walk or you're gonna crawl, or I'm gonna carry you. But you're coming with us. I promised my husband I'd get my babies through, and now you're one of my babies. You understand? She tied the rest of the cornmeal sack and beans in a blanket. She filled 2 tin bottles with water. She kept the jar of penicillin and the last bottle of moonshine. It was all they had for 7 people on a 3-day journey through the wilderness. But words were easier than reality. Tyler couldn't put weight on his broken leg. How would they cross miles of forest, then a hollow, then the ridge? Ethan, Ruth said, her mind working at breakneck speed. Outside, find the strongest branch you can, thick as your arm, tall as me. Quick! While Ethan went out into the growing darkness, Ruth used the cloth she had left from her skirt, and 2 pieces of wood they'd torn from the floor to reinforce Tyler's leg splint, tying it so tight he almost screamed, securing the broken bone as best she could. Ethan came back, dragging a dried pine branch, almost a small log. This'll work. Ruth broke another strip of cloth and tied it at the top of the branch. It's your crutch, she told Tyler. You're gonna lean on this and on me, your arm over my shoulders. You're gonna hop on your good leg. Understand? Tyler nodded, his face pale and sweaty from the effort of preparing himself. They didn't sleep that night. They waited. Every hour dragged. They listened to every sound of the forest, every creak, expecting the trucks to return. But the night remained silent. A tense calm that was almost worse than noise. At 3 in the morning, when the moon was hidden, and the cold was so intense it cut to the bone, Ruth decided it was time. Now, she whispered. She woke the children, who'd fallen asleep from pure exhaustion, curled together. It's time to go. Absolute silence. Like little mice. She dressed the children in the few clothes they had. Ethan, at 12, bent down so Noah 5 could climb on his back. The little boy clung to his brother's neck, half asleep. Lily, grab Rose's hand. Don't let go, no matter what. Don't let go. The twins nodded, their eyes huge in the darkness. Ruth adjusted baby Hope in her shawl, tying her tight against her chest. Then she went to Tyler. Come on, boy, it's now or never. With a grunt of effort from her and a muffled moan of pain from him, she got him on his feet. Tyler put his arm over Ruth's shoulders. She wrapped him around the waist, feeling his ribs under the torn fabric. With his other hand, Tyler gripped the makeshift crutch. They took 1 step, then another. It was slow, agonizingly slow. Ruth opened the makeshift door, which creaked in protest. They went out one by one, into the freezing night. The clearing where the trailer sat looked ghostly under the starlight. Ruth stopped one last second. She looked back at that rusted metal box she'd bought with her last $2,500. The place she'd called perfect, the place she'd cleaned with her own hands, the first roof that had been hers in months. She felt a tug of loss, not for the object, but for the dream it represented. But then she felt Tyler's weight leaning on her, and heard Ethan's scared breathing behind her. That trailer hadn't been a home. It had been a test. A crucible, a place where she'd discovered that saving her children didn't just mean giving them a roof. It meant teaching them to be human, to do what was right even when the world was burning. Let's go, she whispered to the forest, and the 7 figures, 6 small and 1 broken, disappeared among the dark pines, leaving the main path, going into the undergrowth toward the edge of the unknown hollow. The first day was torture that redefined the meaning of suffering for Ruth. Moving in the total darkness of the pathless forest was a nightmare. They moved at a glacial pace. Every step was a battle. Tyler's makeshift crutch got stuck on roots or slipped on pine needles, and with each stumble a moan of pain escaped his lip, a sound that made Ruth tense, expecting it to alert someone. She and Ethan, the 12-year-old boy turned man, had to bear most of Tyler's weight. Tyler's arm over Ruth's shoulders felt like lead, while Ethan pushed from behind, trying to help with the wounded leg. The twins, Lily and Rose, clung to each other, tripping over rocks and branches they couldn't see, their little sobs repressed in the freezing darkness. Ethan, with Noah on his back, was breathing hard but didn't complain. He just followed his mother's shadow. Twice Tyler collapsed completely, his good leg giving out from exhaustion. "I can't, Ruth. Leave me. I swear it's better. Run," he begged from the forest floor. "Shut up and get up," Ruth hissed, her voice a whip of pure will, as she and Ethan got him on his feet again, the effort almost dislocating their own shoulders. They only stopped when the first gray rays of dawn stained the sky, revealing they were on a steep slope, far from any road. They collapsed behind a group of large rocks, hidden by thorny bushes. They were exhausted, frozen, and hungry. Ruth distributed the food. One cold tortilla for each of her older children and for herself. Half for Tyler, who could barely chew. They drank small sips of water from one of the bottles. The silence of dawn was terrifying. "How far did we walk?" Ethan whispered, his shoulders sagging from his brother's weight. "I don't know," Ruth admitted, rubbing baby Hope's chest as she cried weakly. "But we can't stop long. They must have found us gone by now." And as if her words had summoned them, they heard a distant but unmistakable sound. Engines. Not on the path above but below in the valley. On the main road they'd abandoned. Through a clearing in the trees, they saw 2 points of light moving fast. The trucks. And then they heard something that froze their blood. Gunshots. 2, 3, dry, echoing in the mountains. "They're shooting at the trailer," Ethan whispered, horrified. "They're furious," Tyler said, his face pale. "They're hunting." Fear gave them a new surge of adrenaline. "We have to move," Ruth said, getting to her feet, her legs shaking. "They're not just looking anymore. They know we ran." They continued. The sun rose but brought no warmth, only harsh light that exposed their misery. The terrain got harder, the slope steeper. The pine forest began to thin, giving way to rocks and dry brush. Tyler was at his limit. His wounded leg, after the kick in the forced march, was swollen and dark again. Despite the penicillin, the makeshift crutch broke. Now it was Ruth and Ethan dragging him almost completely. The twins cried silently, their cheap plastic shoes destroyed by the stones. By midday they reached the edge. It wasn't a slope. It was a cliff. The hollow. Ruth looked over and felt her stomach drop. It was an immense crack in the earth, hundreds of feet deep, an abyss of red rock and shadow. "Old Man Joe said," crossing the hollow. Ruth whispered, her voice broken by desperation. She looked at the abyss. There was no bridge, no path. It was an impassable wall. They were trapped. The wind whistled at the edge of the hollow, a hollow, empty sound that seemed to mock their desperation. Ethan looked over and his face, already pale from fear and hunger, turned the color of ash. "Mama, it's the end of the world. There's nothing." The twins, seeing the infinite emptiness, let out the screams they'd been holding back, a high, terrified cry that the wind carried away. Tyler collapsed on his good leg, dropping his dead weight from Ruth's shoulders. "It's over," he whispered, his voice broken, not by pain but by absolute defeat. "It's a dead end. I'm sorry, Ruth. My God, I'm sorry. I ruined everything. Take your children and hide in the rocks. Let them find me. Tell them I forced you. Tell them I—" Ruth slapped him. It wasn't a hard blow. It was a dry, desperate blow to snap him out of his stupor. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her voice shaking with icy fury. "Don't you dare give up. Not after what we went through in that trailer. Not after my children went hungry for you." She turned to the hollow, her chest rising and falling, searching for an answer in the immensity of the red rock. Old Man Joe couldn't be that cruel. Crossing the hollow, what did that mean? They couldn't fly. And then they heard it. Not the wind? The echo. The echo of engines and voices bouncing off the hollow walls from above. They were coming along the ridge. They were less than half a mile away, following their trail. They're here, Ethan yelled, his voice breaking with panic. They're gonna see us, Mama. We're exposed. Terror finally broke Ruth's paralysis. Her eyes, sharp from desperation, swept the edge of the cliff. Not across, down. It had to be down. Look for a path, she yelled. A trail. Anything. A way down. She ran along the edge, her children following, stumbling. Tyler tried to drag himself behind them. There, Lily yelled, the quieter twin, pointing with a trembling finger. It wasn't a path. It was a crack in the rock. A scar that descended in an almost vertical zigzag. It looked like a goat trail, barely wide enough for 1 foot. It was suicide. One slip and they'd fall hundreds of feet to the rocks at the bottom. Ruth looked at the path. Then she looked back, the way they'd come. She could hear the men's voices yelling orders. They were minutes away. One was a possible death. The other was certain death. And what they'd do to her and her daughters before killing them would be worse. That's the way, she said, her voice calm. A terrifying calm that silenced her children's crying. That's the path to the hideaway. She turned to Ethan. Ethan, you first. Get Noah off her back. You'll go backwards like you're climbing down a ladder. Use your hands. Don't look down. Just look at the rock in front of you. Understand? Ethan nodded, trembling. Lily, rose behind him, one by one. Don't let go of the rock. She turned to Tyler. You're gonna sit. You're gonna drag yourself on your good hip using your good leg and your hands. I'll be right behind you with hope. If you slip, I'll stop you. Ruth, I can't, he began. Shut up and do it, she yelled. Now. Ethan, go. With one last muffled sob, Ethan, 12 years old, put his brother Noah in front of him and began the terrifying descent into the heart of the abyss. The descent was vertical hell. Ethan, at 12, moved with terrifying precision. His face pale but his hands steady on the rock. He'd place Tadeo's foot in a crack, then lower his own. Backwards to the void, never looking down. Just as his mother had ordered, the twins followed, joined by the hand. Their sobs turned into little gasps of terror. Rose slipped once. A little choked scream. Her foot slipped on loose gravel and her body swayed dangerously toward the abyss. But Lily clung to her hand with the strength of a vice, and Ethan from below reached up and stabilized his sister's foot. Keep going, was all he said. His child's voice broken by tension. Then came Tyler. It was agony. He crawled sitting inch by inch, his broken leg hitting the rock wall. Pain so white and hot it almost made him pass out with each movement. Ruth came last. Baby Hope tied to her chest, her heart beating for all of them. Her eyes weren't on the path, they were on the figures of her children, and Tyler, memorizing each one, pushing them down with her pure will. The hollow wall was a 1,000-foot beast, and they were just insects clinging to its side. They were a third of the way down, maybe 300 feet on the vertical wall when the silhouettes appeared against the bright sky on the edge they'd just abandoned. It was 5 men. Sheriff Colps was among them. They stood still for a second, disbelieving, scanning the void, and then one of them pointed. A shout echoed in the hollow, distorted by the echo. There they are, on the wall. Sons of Colt didn't wait. He raised his rifle. Shoot him, he roared, and the sound of his voice bounced off the rock. A thunder of death. The first shot was a deafening blast. The bullet hit the stone 3 feet above Ruth's head, sending a shower of sharp shards that cut her cheek. The children screamed. This time, a scream of pure terror, and they pressed against the rock, paralyzed. Don't look up, Ruth yelled, her voice louder than the gunshots, more powerful than fear. Keep going down. Move your feet. Ethan, move your sisters. Now. That scream broke the spell. Panic turned into frantic movement. Another shot hit near Tyler, tearing a piece of fabric from his shirt. The path, luckily, was a tight zigzag. They turned around a bend, ducking under a rock overhang that momentarily protected them from direct fire. The men above cursed, moving along the edge, trying to find a better angle, but the wall was too vertical. Quick, quick, Ruth gasped. It was no longer about caution, it was about speed. They slipped, cut their hands, their feet. Tyler let out a scream of pain when his broken leg got stuck in a crack. But Ethan, without hesitating, climbed up 2 steps and freed it by force. They kept going down. A controlled fall, panic giving them inhuman strength. They heard the shots above, bullets bouncing off rock, but they couldn't reach them anymore. They were too far down, too close to the wall. They descended for what seemed like hours, long after the screams and shots stopped. Their muscles were jelly. Their hands bled, thirst was sandpaper in their throats. Finally, when the afternoon sun painted the hollow peaks blood red, Ethan's feet touched solid ground. The bottom of the hollow was a dry riverbed, full of giant rocks. They fell one by one, collapsing on the gravelly sand. Unable to move, Ethan vomited from pure exhaustion. The twins trembled in each other's arms. Tyler lay on his back, his leg a swollen mess. But alive, Ruth, with the baby still asleep on her chest, collapsed to her knees. She touched the solid earth, and for the first time in days she let herself cry. Silently. They'd crossed, but the salvation of the descent was just the beginning of the third trial. The wilderness. They'd escaped the men, but now they faced the relentless nature of the hollow bottom. The dry riverbed, the only path forward, became a furnace as the third day advanced. The sun bounced off the red rock walls, and the heat was suffocating. A silent enemy worse than bullets. The second water bottle ran out at noon. Baby Hope had stopped crying. A lethargic silence that terrified Ruth more than any scream. Noah, too weak to walk, had to be carried alternately by Ethan and Lily. Rose, delirious from thirst, stumbled and fell. Got up silently, her eyes empty. Tyler was dead weight. The makeshift crutch was useless in the deep sand. He and Ruth had developed a horrible routine. He'd hop on his good leg, leaning on her. They'd take 3 steps and collapse. Then rest a minute, and again. Hop, drag, collapse. His hands were destroyed, his lips broken and bleeding. At sunset on the third day, when the sky turned a sickly purple, Ruth collapsed and didn't get up. She saw the rocks, the indifferent sky. We'll die here, she thought. A cold calm invading her. Like the coyotes, Colt said. James, I failed you. Mama. Mateo's voice was a rasp. Look. Smoke. Ruth looked up. She could barely focus. Ethan was pointing at a crack in the hollow wall half a mile away. A thin thread of gray smoke rose in the still air. It wasn't a wildfire. It was a campfire. It was life. That vision broke the apathy. Get up, Ruth yelled, her voice hoarse. Walk, Ethan, carry Noah, Lily, Rose, walk. She stood, dragged Tyler, and they began the last stretch. They didn't walk, they crawled. When they reached the clearing hidden among the rocks, it was almost dark. It wasn't a town. It was 5 or 6 shacks made of rusted tin, stone, and mesquite wood. The hideaway. Men came out of the shadows. Not with assault rifles but with old shotguns and machetes. They were thin, bearded, their faces weathered by sun and distrust. They looked like ghosts. Ruth fell to her knees, raising baby Hope like an offering. Help, she begged. Please. Mr. Garrett, Colt is after us. The children, water, him, one of the men, an old man with eyes that seemed to have seen everything, looked at Tyler, then at the dehydrated children. He spit in the dust. Garrett. Colt. Names of snakes, he said. Bring them in. Give the lady water. The camp was a refuge of dispossessed people. Families who'd refused to give up their land to Garrett and had chosen exile at the bottom of the hollow. Ruth and her children stayed at the hideaway for 7 months. The camp's healer, an old woman named Rosa, looked at Tyler's leg. Gangrene, she said. But the moonshine. And old Joe's penicillin stopped it. I know his mark. You're lucky, boy. And you got guts, widow. With herbs and a red-hot knife, Rosa saved the leg, though Tyler would be left with a permanent limp. The children regained their weight. Ethan learned to hunt with the men. Life was hard. Primitive, but free. When Tyler was strong enough, the miners guided him north through routes only they knew. A journey of weeks through the desert until he crossed the border in Arizona. Ruth didn't hear anything from him for a year. Life continued until one day, a miner returned from a trip to town and looked for Ruth. Old man Joe had died of old age in his bed. But he'd left her a letter. It was from Tyler. He'd made it to Colorado, and he hadn't kept quiet. He'd contacted journalists, human rights groups. He'd talked about the mill, the airstrip, Garrett. In 1990, the news reached the hideaway like thunder. The federal government, pressured by the United States over the attempted murder of an American student, they never mentioned the drugs, had raided the mill. There was a shootout. Sheriff Colt was killed. Mr. Garrett was arrested, not for drugs but for tax evasion, illegal logging, and the murder of Old Man Joe's grandson. Denver, Colorado. January 20. It's snowing outside. Ruth Hawkins, now 62, watches her grandchildren play in the yard of a small warm apartment. Her hands, though marked, are soft. Ethan, Lily, Rose and Noah live nearby, all American citizens with their own families. Hope, the baby from the shawl, is in college. The doorbell rings. It's Tyler Bennett, 43, a biology professor at the local university. His limp is pronounced. In his hands he brings a dish. "Hey, Mama Ruth," he says, the nickname he gave her at the hideaway. His English is perfect. "I brought you this apple pie, like the one you said I asked for in my delirium." Ruth laughs, a soft sound, and hugs him. They sit in the kitchen while the children laugh. "Sometimes I dream about the trailer," Ruth says quietly. "The smell, the fear, under the sink." Tyler nods, his face suddenly somber. "I dream about the hole, and the foreman's boot." I bit my tongue almost in half. Not to scream. "I know, son, I know. You bought that wreck with everything you had, Ruth," Tyler says, looking at her. "You thought you were buying a roof." Ruth looks at the falling snow. She looks at her grandchildren, safe and loud. She looks at the man whose life she saved, and who in turn saved her whole family by sponsoring their asylum in the United States. "No," she says, her eyes full of clarity earned through effort. "I bought something better. I bought the chance to teach my children that an ounce of courage is worth more than a ton of fear. I bought the right to truly call myself their mother." And what do you think about Ruth's decision? Was it crazy? Was it courage? Or was it simply what a mother has to do? It moves me so much to read your own stories of strength here. If this story touched your heart, if you believe compassion is the greatest act of resistance that exists, I invite you to subscribe. You're not alone in this community of people who feel deeply. Tell us in the comments what you felt, what you learned from Ruth's decision in that trailer. We want to read you. And please share this story so that Ruth's voice and the voices of so many people who do what's right can be heard. Every story carries within it an echo of our shared humanity. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone special. Leave us a comment about what you felt, and subscribe to join us for more soul-reaching stories. Because every life tells a story that deserves to be heard. See you next time.